Hello. Hey, Rick.
How's it
Hey,
going?
everybody. I'm doing well. For once, we have sun. We're competing with California. We have sun. We hope that wherever you are, that the weather is nice. Obviously, the topic today reminds us that we're all sheltering in place. But we hope that this virtual gathering gives you an opportunity to feel like you're connected to science and to us. I've been starting by saying, of course, my name is Ann Merchant, and I work for the National Academy of Sciences, and I'm joined by.
I'm Rick Levert. I'm the program director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
And we're both very glad, as I say, that you're here. I've been starting events sort of at the top of the hour, talking about some of my virtual tour of the world, since I'm not able to tour the world in a normal way. I was looking at something called Peacock Presents at Home Variety Show. Seth MacFarlane is a member of the board at the Science and Entertainment Exchange, and he's producing this. The first episode is available on YouTube. It was kind of fun. Monk, for those of you who used to watch that TV show, you may remember that he was an avowed germaphobe, and so it is now Monk's time in the sun. So Monk came back to remind us about all the ways that we can stay safe from the microbes that are out there ready to get us. The other thing that I was watching was I've been sort of, I think we've all been binge watching some things. For me, it's been Schitt's Creek and Alexis. There's a 2-minute video of her just saying David, which sounds completely boring, and it's hilarious. I highly recommend it. And then Bon Appetit asked their chefs to talk about the oldest thing in their pantry. For me, it is this. I went and looked in my pantry, and they were supposed to taste it. These are fresh chili flakes in oil. I'm not going to taste it. They expired in 2014, but they're chili flakes in oil. I don't know. They can't expire, right? So I'm going to cook with them when it gets really desperate and I can't go to the grocery store. That's my plan. That was my tour this week of the internet. And then I like to say a little bit about the National Academy of Sciences. What's especially relevant is the big consensus reports that we do at the National Academy of Sciences. We were created by Abraham Lincoln to provide good, sound, solid advice to policymakers. And we recently came out with a report at the end of February. I'm going to look at my notes. It's called Social Isolation and Loneliness in Older Adults. And this was jointly created by our Health and Medicine Division and the Division on Behavioral Social Sciences and Education. And, this is the consensus report process brings together experts from a variety of disciplines to weigh in, to answer questions that are important on particular topics. And I think we've seen a lot of the headlines that loneliness and social isolation impact our physical and mental health in ways that we hadn't previously recognized. So this was something that the academies was asked to weigh in on. And we provided a vision for the healthcare profession to try to address some of that, particularly in cohorts of older Americans. But we find ourselves in a situation now where we're all feeling a little bit of social isolation. So that's why we were very happy to be able to do this event today. So I'm going to pass it to Rick now that I've talked a little bit about the Academy to talk about the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
Everybody, my name is Rick Levert. I'm the program director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a program of the National Academy of Sciences, which I didn't say. First, I want to thank our AV team. Meche, thank you for all of your help today. And for Courtney, Jeff, and Sachi, thank you for helping us organize this event. Wouldn't have happened without you. Also want to thank former NASA astronaut Rick Mistracchio for live tweeting. You are our most overqualified live tweeter, and we appreciate you tweeting this event today. We got to get you back on our stage sometime, and I hope you're well. So for those of you who don't know what the Science and Entertainment Exchange is, if you are a writer, producer, director, studio executive, actor, you're working on a feature film, a TV show, a video game, you have any mass media project, you have a question about science, you call or email us, that's me or Sachi, who's also somewhere in the background today, and we will connect you with a field expert who hopefully knows what they're doing and saying for free. It's a volunteer service, and it's our role to be the bridge between scientists and engineers and creative people who are making big content. So we've done over 3,000 consults since we opened our doors, including Avengers Infinity War, Man of Steel, Black Panther, Captain Marvel. We tend to work on big Hollywood projects. If you are a STEM professional and you're new to our audience and you're just tuning in and you're wondering what the heck the Science and Entertainment Exchange is and why I'm not talking about social isolation, it's because that's not my expertise. Please, as a STEM professional, if you're interested in getting involved, please shoot us an email to me or to Sachi. You can go to our website. You can click rlevered@nas.edu in case you're wondering. Please contact us. We're always looking for new people. I would also be totally remiss if I did not thank our sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, who is actually paying for this event today. So thank you. We would not be here without you. The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Walt Disney Company, Film Nation, Google, Lyda Hill Foundation, Corteva, and individual donors like many of you. For those of you who clicked the donate button, thank you so much for doing that. We know it's a crazy time. We know right now science and facts matter more than ever and hopefully are having a bigger impact on our culture than ever before. We know not everybody is in a position to give right now, but if you are in a position to give, if you enjoy the program today, please do consider donating. It actually goes directly back into this programming. So, you make it happen. So thank you. A little bit about the event structure. You are going to hear 3 speakers. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to deliver you some mind-blowing information. If at any point during those talks you have a question, there's a little Q&A tab down here at the bottom. I have a pen in my hand, which is weird because this is like a digital event, but I'm going to be writing stuff down and trying to make sure that all the best questions, all the questions that get asked again and again or in different formats and all that get sort of put together for a very limited window of Q&A. Very sorry if we don't get to your question. We're going to try to get to as many as we humanly possibly can during that 20-minute period. And to help facilitate that, I will now turn it back to Anne and stop talking.
Yes, and I'm not going to talk very long. I just want to, I received this book right before we went into lockdown. And a lot of our job is about bringing people together for events like this, usually in much smaller rooms and in smaller number. But we do gather people a lot. And I think that it's our natural human instinct to want to gather, to enjoy the act of gathering. How we gather matters, but we don't have so much control over how we're gathering these days. And so we felt it was important to bring in some experts to reflect on that, to talk about that. So we were very happy to be able to find 3 people who were not on airplanes and not giving their speaking engagements that took them on the road and were able to give us some time today. So we want to thank all 3 of them. But we want to start by turning to a member of our committee from the Social Isolation Report. Julianne was part of that whole process, and she knows that it's a long process, but we were really happy to have somebody from the committee to come in and talk about that. So Julianne's going to kick us off, and I'm going to turn it over to her because, as Rick said, I'm not what you're here for, and neither is he. So we will be quiet, and we will let the experts take it from here.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Science and Entertainment Exchange for including me on this panel. I'm thrilled to be here, and for everyone who's joining. This is so important, in the light of the current pandemic, to have evidence-based information. And so I'm happy to help in any way that I possibly can. And so just wanted to give you a brief background of who I am. So I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience, and my area of expertise is focused on understanding the association between social relationships and physical health. And as mentioned, I was a member of that National Academy of Science committee that recently issued that report on social isolation and loneliness. One of the things to keep in mind is that report is available to the public, so anyone can access that. But it is important to note that this report was specific to those over the age of 50. But as we know, social isolation and loneliness can affect anyone at any age. So I first wanted to start really by defining what is even meant by social isolation and loneliness, because we use the terms a lot and they're going to come up throughout the hour. And it might be important to distinguish them because they are related but separate. So social isolation is objectively being alone, having few relationships or infrequent social contact, whereas loneliness is subjectively feeling alone. It's the discrepancy between one's desired level of connection and one's actual level of connection. And so you can be isolated but not lonely, and lonely but not isolated, or both. Also, I wanted to define its counterpart, social connection, because both isolation and loneliness are ways that we feel disconnected from others or are disconnected. And being socially connected is how we connect to others and our relationships in a variety of ways. So this has broadly been categorized in 3 different ways in the science. So there's the structural ways of connecting to others. This really has to do with the presence or absence of others. This includes the size of our social network, whether or not we live alone, the extent to which we participate socially. The second is the functions that our relationships serve. So the extent to which we can count on others for emotional support, advice, or a favor. And then finally, the quality of our relationships. Of course, not all relationships are entirely positive. And so this is the sense of connection that we have to others based on positive and negative qualities. And the current COVID-19 crisis this situation has really highlighted how much of our lives involve other people. Now that we have to socially distance, which I would argue we should label physical distance instead, but this has affected every aspect of our lives, from the way we work to the way we shop, the way we play, etc. So just to kind of illustrate this, I thought I would share how this affected my own family. This whole pandemic for me, there was a kind of a culminating date on March 11th. We were celebrating my father's 81st birthday at a restaurant. And we were gathered, my siblings and my parents. And as we're having dinner, we start getting the news alerts popping up. Rudy Gobert had tested positive. And then the next alert was, they evacuated the Jazz game. And then the next alert was that the NBA suspended the entire NBA season. And then the next alert was that Tom Hanks had tested positive. And we all left that gathering knowing that things were getting serious, but really not having a good sense of not only that would be the last time that we gathered together as a family for the foreseeable future, but really what lie ahead of us. Now, of course, the next day is when many governors started announcing restrictions that led to the closing of universities and schools and businesses. And so, for me personally, I'm working from home. My husband's working from home. My kids are doing online school. But for my sister, she's a single mother, and she works in the healthcare industry and is struggling with trying to cover childcare. My parents, who had recently moved into a senior living community, are unable to have visitors and struggle with technology. And so there's, these changes that we have even within my family, recognize that, our family doesn't represent the myriad of situations. But what we recognize is that we're all facing the same crisis, but it affects people differently based on their life situation. And so staying home for some people can mean being completely isolated from the rest of the world. It can mean more quality time with family or roommates. It can mean escalation of conflict or even abuse. And some don't even have the luxury of staying home. So on the one hand, we see society coming together and there's this solidarity around a common struggle. But the struggle has various forms and affects some to a larger extent than others. So, why does this all matter? Part of this is due to the fact that prevalence rates of isolation and loneliness were already high even before this crisis. So prevalence rates before this ranged anywhere from 22% to over 50%. And the highest prevalence rates actually were among the young. And not surprisingly, some recent preliminary surveys suggest that loneliness and distress is increasing during this. But of course, there are important health implications. This social isolation and loneliness were already being recognized as a public health crisis. A couple of years ago, the UK appointed a minister for loneliness to address the health effects of this. So when it comes to the health effects, we have robust scientific evidence that social isolation and loneliness are independent risk factors for premature mortality. And social connection is a significant protective factor. So just for example, my colleagues and I conducted a meta-analysis of data from over 3.4 million participants from around the world. And what we found was that loneliness was associated with a 26% increased risk for earlier death, social isolation a 29%, and living alone a 32% increased risk for earlier death from all causes. Now, conversely, being socially connected is associated with a 50% increased odds of survival. There's also evidence that social isolation and loneliness increase our risk for heart attack, stroke, type 2 diabetes. And while all of these are more of the long-term kinds of effects, we also are aware of short-term effects. And most of us are feeling significant distress. This is normal. This is our body signaling a need to reconnect. Just like hunger signals us to eat and thirst signals us to drink water, loneliness is thought to be a biological drive that motivates us to reconnect. Throughout human history, we have relied on others for survival, and proximity to others, particularly trusted others, signals safety. So when we lack proximity to trusted others, our brain and body must respond with a state of heightened alert. This can result in heightened blood pressure, stress hormones, inflammatory processes, which, if experienced on a chronic basis, put us at increased risk for a variety of chronic illnesses. In fact, some research has shown that social isolation and loneliness have even been linked to greater susceptibility to a cold virus and respiratory illnesses. But unfortunately, this pandemic, it can be particularly distressing because we're feeling this heightened desire to be with others and few options to satisfy this need. We are literally craving others. And so, to a large extent, we are trying to satisfy this craving via technology. And reports are showing increased use of social media and other digital formats, yet we don't have really strong evidence of the equivalence of these. I know this is really complex, and I suspect that my other panelists are going to have a lot to add to this, and I'd love to come back and talk more about this.
Thank you very much, Julianne. That was great. And it's a really nice way to kick us off. We're going to now turn to Diana. And, I always feel super fortunate because my network at the National Academies is vast and amazing. So I reached out to Susan Fisk, who is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and was asking her about potential panelists to supplement. And she said, well, I don't know if you know Diana, but you need to get in touch with her and ask her to participate in this. So I did, and I gave you the wrong time to start off with. So I had to say, are you still available? So I'm glad that you are and that you're here, and I'm going to give it to you now, Diana.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne, for having me. It is an honor to be here, speaking to everyone here at the Exchange and speaking with two researchers that I greatly respect. I'm excited to share with you all today some of the work that my lab has been doing on the topic of human sociality and the potential impact of social isolation. So to start, though, I want to ask you to make a hypothetical decision. If I offered you this option, would you take it? So would you pay $1 to have a pre-coronavirus style coffee chat with your best friend? What about if I offered you $5? Sorry, would you pay $1? Would you pay $5? Would you pay $50? What about $100? My guess is that some of you might even pay a lot more than that in order to interact with your best friend. And research from my lab indeed shows that people are willing to forego significant amounts of money for the opportunity to interact with another person. People value social interaction so much that if you put a price tag on it, people will be willing to pay. So I want to ask you now another hypothetical decision. Would you pay $1 if it would give you permission to safely go to a coffee shop where your friend was, but you couldn't talk to them? You couldn't update each other on your lives. You couldn't talk about the latest coronavirus news. In fact, you couldn't even sit near them. You wouldn't be able to see them. You would just be in the same place at the same time as your friend. Would you still pay $1 for that experience? Now, my guess is that you're probably feeling a little bit more hesitation to say yes now that you did at the outset, but you probably still would. In research in my lab, we find that people are overwhelmingly willing to forego money in order to simply do something at the same time as another person, even without any real interaction, without being able to see the person at all, to simply coexist with another person. And outside of these hypotheticals, in fact, you see that people pre-COVID made this choice all the time. People opt to eat at a restaurant together with a friend over eating alone, even though the food's going to taste just as good either way. People prefer to go watch a movie with a friend rather than going to a movie alone, even though during the movie, you're unlikely to say one word to your friend. We prefer to watch Facebook Live videos or live Twitch shows over watching the same content after the fact. And what I think this all suggests is that there's just some value to knowing that another person is there, experiencing the same thing that you are. So we value real social interaction, real live interaction so much that we're willing to settle for even super impoverished replacements for it, mere co-experience. So what I think this suggests is that people are so strongly driven to engage in social interaction, they will literally incur monetary costs. They will also potentially incur even more serious costs. We see right now that people around the country are protesting for the opportunity to resume their normal social lives. And there are many reasons why someone might be engaging in those protests and risking physical danger to themselves and to others. Maybe they really need a haircut, or more seriously, maybe they're struggling financially and want the opportunity to go back to work. But I think there's, at the root of it, maybe one need that they're not getting satisfied right now, one need that we've probably all noticed in this moment, which is that we need more social connection than we're getting. To some, I think that value of social connection and social interaction is worth so much that it seems to outweigh the potential cost of life that might come if we open up the country too early. So I think this raises a puzzle, which is, why do we do this? Why do we value mere co-experience so deeply that we pursue it even when it pales in comparison to the kind of rich social interaction that we actually want? And why do we pursue any and all social opportunities despite sometimes the potential tremendous costs they might incur. And I think research in psychology offers us two nice types of answers to this question. One compelling answer to this question comes from research in neuroscience. So we know from this research that social interaction is rewarding. Social stimuli literally activate neural regions in our brain associated with reward, regions in the midbrain, the basal ganglia, and the prefrontal cortex. This neural reward system responds to all sorts of rewarding stimuli like food, money, sex, drugs, and to social stimuli. Now, this reward system does more than just label stimuli as rewarding. It also motivates behavior to acquire that valued stimulus. So over time, this neural reward system has learned that the social world is rewarding, and as a result, the system pushes us to seize on opportunities to engage with the social world. So it's this expectation of a social reward in the moment that can help explain why people clamor for social experiences, even the most minimalistic ones, and even the ones that come at a cost. Now, the advanced talk that we just heard also offers a second compelling answer to this puzzle of why people are so driven to engage in social experiences. We literally need other people in order to survive. This need is as real as the need to eat and sleep. So much so that without social connection, our bodies will start to fail us. We will increase the chances of premature mortality. So social connection protects our physical well-being and our mental well-being. Loneliness, on the other hand, is psychologically disastrous. So we strive to connect with people because doing so helps us in the long run to survive and to thrive. So here I've given you two explanations for why people seek social connections at all costs. The first is about momentary experience of social stimuli. They provide us with momentary feelings of subjective reward, and we chase that reward by pursuing social interactions. And the second is about the long-term value of social connection. It provides us with a long-term survival advantage. Now, in our real life, in our pre-social distancing life, our social interactions were designed to both provide us with this momentary feeling of subjective reward and to support our long-term survival. So some of you might be wondering, and as the last talk let off asking, what are we supposed to do now that we can't pursue those kinds of face-to-face interactions anymore? And we know that with the onset of social distancing policies, people have flocked to social media, to their phones, to the internet, to Zoom, in order to satisfy their social needs. And so given this massive shift in our social behaviors, it is essential to know whether or not virtual or mediated interaction truly fulfills our social needs. Can these interactions stave off loneliness? Or do we need to interact with a real three-dimensional human in order to reap the benefits of social interaction? Now, this is a fascinating and important question, and the answer is, it depends. So much of what we know from psychology on this question looks at social media. So we have some answers about that. We know that social media platforms are designed to provide primarily momentary rewards and not the kind of true deep social connections that we need for long-term survival. They give us access to easy social rewards. We can share lots of information with lots of people at once. That's much more efficient than having a one-on-one conversation with each of our Facebook friends. We can get positive social feedback from lots of people, but we should not mistake these likes and retweets for real social connection. These easy rewards do not always pave the path to true social connection. When it comes to social interaction, instead of going for these easy rewards, we need to find ways to serve our long-term social needs. And we can do this online, but we need to be mindful of how we harness these platforms to make sure that they truly do serve our needs rather than our momentary wants. So one thing we know for sure is that when it comes to social media, it's particularly important to use these platforms to actively connect with people rather than passively view others' content. So passively scrolling through a feed is the least powerful way to interact, and in fact, it can lead to decreases in well-being. On the other hand, actively interacting on social media, for example, by commenting on posts or direct messaging people, is going to help you build up your social connections and your social capital more effectively. So we have some answers about social media. Use it actively, but not passively. But I think the more pressing question here is, can Zoom or phone calls satisfy and sustain our social connections? This is a phenomenally important question, and one that I think we simply need more data on. In my lab, we're conducting research right now to try to find out. Some very preliminary results confirms that you don't really want to do this over social media. Time spent on social media is associated with greater loneliness. Instead, phone calls, video calls, and texting seem to be more powerful avenues for social connection than anything that social media can offer. But of course, even those, what we're finding are pale comparisons to what happens when you actually spend time interacting with 3D people. So we're still collecting data on this, but we hope in the end to understand which modes of connection are most effective at helping people stave off loneliness. If you want to help us resolve this question, I encourage you to participate in our studies. You can go online to distancingsurvey.com or download our mobile app, The Person Project. So with that, I'll just wrap up. Here are 2 takeaways that I think might help us understand the moment of social isolation that we're in right now and help sustain us through it. First is that people value social opportunities. We value them so much that we will incur substantial costs in order to attain them. And the second is that during these periods of isolation, virtual interactions can help fill the gaps, but it matters a great deal how we're using them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Diana. And, I don't know if your offer was real, but, I do have a couple dollars and I'm willing to spend them. And I don't know how many of you noticed, but Diana was in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood in his living room. So that sounds like a really comfy place to have a copy. So we are now going to turn to our third speaker. And actually, I think Jay has a very different background. But again, our network at the academies was really helpful for me to connect with Jay because the folks at our Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences, the first name they gave me was Jay's. So it's always nice to start at the top of the list and not have to go down any further. So I'm going to turn it over to Jay and let him take us through his talk.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thanks for having me here and everybody for joining us. My name is Jay Van Bavel. I'm a psychologist, also with connections in neuroscience and business at New York University. So I thought I'd have the Statue of Liberty in the background to kind of signal what it feels like in New York right now for many of us who are shut down here. It's pretty tragic. So I'm going to build on the great presentations thus far and also talk a little bit about the dark side of what people are going through. So let's start at the beginning. The way that we study these types of topics and behavior scientifically is that we see what happens when something is added or removed from a situation. So for instance, I'm in neuroscience, and if you want to know what a part of the brain does, you can see what happens when people are missing a part of that brain. So for example, when people have damage to their hippocampus, it affects their memory. And then you can see all the consequences of that for people. And so for the last few decades, as you've heard, scientists have been studying what happens when we lose something, when we lose our social connections, when we're socially isolated or feel lonely. And I think right now we're living in potentially the largest social isolation experiment in history. We're seeing, millions of people around the world go through this at the same time. And as you've heard from the other speakers, what we can expect to happen in this massive global experiment are things like loneliness and depression. We might expect, based on the science, disruptions in sleep, increases in the stress hormones coursing through your body. It's not all bad, though. You might find pockets of deep and creative work. So many of you might have heard the stories about Isaac Newton, one of the most famous scientists in history. And so when the Great Plague of London ravaged through the British city in 1665, Isaac Newton was safely removed from the city. He was a student in Cambridge. And this period for him was now known as Annus Mirabilis, which is known as the Year of Wonders. And in that year of the plague, where he was basically socially isolated, he created calculus, he discovered gravity, and he created the laws of motion. And so that's certainly not the normative response. Most of us won't go through anything like that. But some of us will be going through a different period where we have time to read and think and engage more deeply in reflection and creating meaning and producing other projects. So I just want to say it's not necessarily all bad. You'll find all kinds of different ways that people are coping with this because it's disrupting our habits in some pretty significant ways. But for most of us, what's happening is we'll be looking for ways to solve the problem of loneliness. So I like to think of our social needs a lot like our other needs and motives. So if you're hungry, you look for food. You start scrounging through your kitchen. If you're thirsty, you look for something to drink. If you're socially isolated, you look for social connection. You need to scratch that itch. You need to fulfill that need in some way, just like you do with hunger and thirst. And so where do we find that? And this is where my research explores. And what we find is that people, especially when they're socially needy or isolated, they look for their tribe. They look for the identities or people like them. So if you imagine, and close your eyes, it's probably been a while since you were at a crowded conference or at a cocktail party. Imagine walking into a party, close your eyes, and you see a room full of people, 100 or more people. Where do your eyes go that first moment when you're walking in? What you're usually looking for, if it's not the bar, what you're looking for at that point usually is a friend, or at least someone who shares some identity with you. So if you're a producer, it might be other producers. If you're a showrunner, it might be other showrunners. If you work for Warner Brothers, it might be other people you recognize from Warner Brothers. And this takes all kinds of different forms. So when I was a teenager, I was about 17, I went with my high school from a small town in rural Alberta, Canada. It was my first time I'd ever left the country. And we flew to Italy for an entire 2-week tour of the country. And we spent one day in Venice, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The type of place we all look forward to going when it's safe to travel again. And naturally, what do I do? A Canadian kid, all alone in Venice, I decided to go for lunch at McDonald's. One of the, probably the worst places you could go for lunch in Venice. And while I was in line by myself, surrounded by strangers, this teenage girl came over to me and started talking to me instantly in English. And I hadn't said anything. And you might think, well, how did she know? Everybody else was Italian or a tourist from other countries. It turns out that she came over and knew what I spoke because she was Canadian too. And in a sea of complete strangers, and she's on her own tour trip, she saw a small Canadian maple leaf I had on my sweater for the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team. And she instantly used that to figure I was part of her tribe. And that it was safe to come over and talk to me. But this wouldn't have happened if I was in Canada. If I was in Canada wearing that same sweater and she saw me in a line at McDonald's, she wouldn't have come up to me. What it meant is that you look for people when you're surrounded by strangers that have a distinctive identity. That's like it signals that you're safe for them to connect with. And again, you might have the Canadian stereotype that we're friendly, but we're not that friendly. This is something that people do. I know Larry David had a great scene on this where he was in New York. Someone from LA comes and sees him in New York and starts talking and says, we should get together. And Larry David, of course, in his typical cynical style says, why do we get together in New York? We don't get together in LA. But the reality is for most of us, we would get together with a complete stranger or someone we don't know very much when you're away, even when you wouldn't get together with them at home, because that identity becomes really powerful for you in that moment. And so this is one of the ways we define connections. We define who are safe to approach. And when we're on the other side of the world, that might be someone who I would never otherwise talk to at home. Or if you're on the other side of the country, it's someone from LA, right? And this happens all kinds of ways. So is anybody here watching ESPN's The Last Dance about Michael Jordan and the Bulls in the 80s and 90s? I've been watching it. It's been getting me through this. The same psychology is here when a Bulls fan goes to a game. They throw on a Jordan jersey, and suddenly they start giving high fives to the complete strangers around them. That jersey signals that they're part of the same team for that 3 hours that they're at the game. Or it's why Lakers fans were crying and in mourning when Kobe's helicopter crashed a few months ago. Even though they might never have met him, they might never have even been to a Lakers game or never have lived in LA, they feel a connection because of that identity. So how does this unfold in a pandemic? Well, right now we're doing it online. So as Diana mentioned, this is nothing new, and it's not always a good thing. So I'll just, in the last minute, tell you a couple of cases where this might be happening in interesting ways. Some of you have probably heard of incels, and these are men who feel lonely and rejected, and so they seek solace online from other men. They're trying to find and create their tribe. Of course, this is also a place where they can develop kind of distorted and misogynistic views of women. And so they're trying to get these needs met, but it can create all kinds of kind of cultish psychology. it's also how we debate politics now. Most people debate politics online. This is something I've studied, is how people talk about it on Twitter. And it's where people signal their identities online. The language you use, the words you use, the memes and symbols you use are like bat signals. We send them out into the world and they signal to our followers who we are and what they can expect from us and if they can trust us. It also gets us new followers. It can make our messages go viral. And so we found that when people use really powerful identity-based language, it's most likely to get retweeted or shared or engaged with, which is often what we're looking for. And online is really powerful because you can quantify the social feedback. So if I'm at a cocktail party with you guys, I say a joke, I'm trying to kind of gauge the room to see if it landed. And it's always a little bit unclear. I'm not sure if I'm going to get invited back to the next cocktail party, but online you can see you got 42 likes and 32 retweets. And so you can see that if it landed better than the last time you made a joke. And that happens instantly. So it's quantifiable, it's clear, and it's instantaneous. And so that's what's happening online. But the problem is also that the language that's powerful for certain identities can help people flock to us who share it and can help them reinforce it or amplify it. It can also alienate other people or other groups. And so what we found is when people use moral, emotional language online, when they're talking about things like politics, it's more likely to get shared or retweeted by people who are like-minded, who are part of their team, or share their ideology. But when we look at the data, it's less likely to get shared by someone who's different from them. And so this is also what happens when we're overreaching and really trying to signal who we are. It can get reinforced, and we're hearing the reinforcement, but we're often not seeing who it's alienating or disconnecting us from. You've probably had that experience at Thanksgiving dinner when you have to listen to like your uncle rant about politics. You just kind of shut down or disengage. Research shows people spend about 20 to 30 minutes less time at Thanksgiving dinners over the last few years when they're at a politically different family member's house. So it's disconnecting people. And so it can put you in an echo chamber too. So this is the way that social isolation works. We can be desperate to connect, but it's often a double-edged sword. Well, some things can connect us, they can also alienate us even more. So I realize my time's up, so I'll pass it back to Anne, and I look forward to your questions and thoughts.
It's actually Rick. I'm going to moderate a little bit this Q&A. So I think the first question that I've seen more than once in a few different ways are, why are there some people who actually actively avoid being social or connecting with other people?
I guess if no one jumps in, I'll just say there's individual differences. So some of us might be extroverted. We need a lot of social contact. Others are introverted and they don't need it as much. And so it's kind of like, again, you go to the metaphor food or thirst. Some of us have bigger appetites than others for social connection and stimulation and interaction.
I'll just add to that, which is, even though some people seek out social interaction more than others, everyone does need it. Both introverts and extroverts benefit from having strong social connections, and they suffer when they don't have it.
Yeah, I was going to just echo what Diana said. And when it comes to the physical health effects, we do not see differences in terms of extroverts and introverts. And in fact, there is some evidence to suggest that loneliness is higher among introverts compared to extroverts.
So for older adults who might not be super wired and living a lifestyle of constant video conferencing, what are some no or low tech solutions to alleviate isolation during this time period?
I guess I can jump in. So certainly if there are ways to connect in person at a safe distance, so whether that's talking to an elderly neighbor, who lives across the street from their porch, you can still talk to them, face to face in that way. As Diana was talking about, phone calls are also a a way to connect emotionally and be a source of emotional support for others. So those are both some lower tech ways that we can still connect.
So is there concern that if you're an extroverted person, that this experience of social isolation might change your desire to be quite as extroverted on the other side?
That's an interesting question. So I don't know about any sort of long-term change. I don't know that there's data on this. If either of you know, please tell me. But we've run some studies in my lab where we've looked at short-term isolation and found that when you take away social stimuli and then look at what people are thinking about, you might think that, you know, if people become lonely, then they'll try to kind of make up for the difference in the lack of people by, you know, thinking about people more and kind of satiating themselves by thinking about their friends or whatnot. But we find that what happens is actually the opposite. When you take away social stimuli, people think about the social world less, suggesting that, you know, one thing that our ongoing thoughts are doing is kind of just processing the world around us, and the world around us is usually social. So when you take away that social world, the amount that we end up thinking about the social world decreases. Now in that study, we didn't manipulate how lonely people felt, and I think it's an open question whether or not loneliness might actually have the opposite effect, and whether or not that affects extroverts differently, we just don't know.
I'll also jump in. So as she said, of course, we don't have data on long-term effects yet. A colleague of mine, Rich Slatcher, recently did a survey to test the hypothesis of, you know, whether extroverts are suffering more during this, because it's more of a change for extroverts compared to others. And what he found was that that hypothesis was not supported at all.
What about where you're socially isolating? Does it matter if you're in a city versus the country versus the suburbs?
It might matter for your risks in terms of your health. There's also some research showing that if you get more nature, it can be restorative psychologically to you. So that can be a potential benefit. It might also depend on the nature of the social isolation. Like, are you there alone completely? Or are you there maybe with your family or a partner? And that might mitigate a lot of the effects of the distancing from your normal friend group or colleagues. And again, the other thing is the social isolation is happening in different ways for each of us. So some of us are maintaining social connection through phone calls and Zoom and online virtual meetings or conversations. And so again, if you're able to get your social needs met through those kind of through technologically mediated connections, then the effect might not matter that much where you are. That would be my prediction. But again, this is the great experiment of social disconnection. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out.
Do you have any thoughts on how routines might play in to how socially isolated you feel, whether or not you have a routine?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Is that your social routines, or is it just like your routine? Let's say you're a writer sitting down every morning to write.
Yeah, I think in this case it was more the latter. It sounded like the question actually came from a writer who was actually mentioned that they write for 2 hours every morning, and they wanted to know if that was helping or not.
Well, it may have something to do with the routine, but there's also some evidence to suggest that creative expression can help with feelings of loneliness. And so, you know, writing is certainly a creative expression. And so there may be multiple components to activities such as that that help mitigate some of the distress. So not only is it something that gives structure to your day, it may also mitigate distress because it's distracting from, you know, being focused on all of the horrible things that are happening in the world. But then there's also that creative expression component of it.
Would you say is there any group of people who are actually happier in social isolation, or is it just something basic to being human that nobody's happier in social isolation?
We have a little bit of data on this from our current survey. We asked people not only how happy they are now, but changes from before. And you know, there's, as with every thing that you might measure with psychology, a lot of individual differences here. So some people on that particular day might have reported being happier. Others reported being less happy.
Not from my own data, but I recently saw a survey that was done that looked at the effects of various age groups, and it wasn't necessarily happiness, but did find that among I believe it was Gen Z, it could have been millennials, but they found that there was less pressure to engage socially. So this age group also reported greater loneliness, but also reported greater relief from the pressure to be social.
I think there's a lot of different ways that people can respond to extreme events. You know, there's some folks who respond really intensely, but then are able to recover well from that. And I think a lot of people are in that category. There's other folks who are not affected nearly as much, and so kind of stay at their baseline. And then there's other folks where the effects don't really kind of happen right away, but they accumulate over time, and so you end up worse off. So I think, you know, again, there's just going to be a lot of variation in how you accommodate your new experiences and regulate whatever sorts of emotions come up as a result.
And I'll piggyback off on that because I've done several studies looking at social support, and what our data shows is that even when faced with the same challenge, individuals who have more supportive people in their social network show less reactivity to stress and lower depression, greater satisfaction with life, and other health kinds of outcomes. And so the extent to which people can perceive that they have a supportive network, this can mitigate many of those negative effects, and so those individuals may fare better in this situation.
So within that sort of supportive network, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. This may be our last question. We have a couple minutes left. So can you give us any thoughts on psychologically getting that support that you're talking about from home versus coworkers, family, friends, and also speak to some of the folks who might be in quarantine now with someone who, when they come out, they will definitely be getting a divorce. As that all factors in, do you have any thoughts on staying healthy and drawing from different networks?
I can speak to that. I don't want to take away from the other panelists, but so my research has focused on how different aspects of being socially connected impacts well-being, and this includes a diversity of kinds of relationships and roles. And what we find is that different kinds of relationships can fulfill different kinds of needs and goals for an individual. And so having relationships with family members and friends and coworkers and a faith-based community and a hobby, these these varying different types of relationships and roles that we get different things from them. And so this can, this is associated with, a variety of different health outcomes, and they may tap into different kinds of pathways. But as you mentioned, relationship quality is really important. And while we have evidence of the protective effects of supportive relationships, what we find is that negativity in relationships is actually associated with greater risk. So not only has it been linked to increased risk for earlier mortality, but relationships not only can help us cope with stress, they can be sources of stress. And interpersonal stress is shown to have even exaggerated levels of physiological response relative to non-social stressors. And so really, when we think about the benefits of being socially connected, it's really about these positive and supportive relationships. And so, yes, relationships are incredibly important and incredibly powerful, but they can be incredibly powerful for good or for bad. So it is important to nurture high quality relationships.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I saw some data that divorces might be increasing, spousal abuse might be increasing. So yeah, it's almost like but I also saw some evidence that if you're in a healthy relationship, if anything, it's made people feel happy to spend time with those people. So it's not necessarily always good to be shut in your house with a family member or another person. Even if you have that social connection, it could be bad if the relationship is stressed.
Diana, do you have anything for the last word, or shall we move on?
I think that's a great way to end.
All right. Well, then with that, Anne, if you could jump back on here, would like to thank all of our speakers today for taking the time to do this and to answer our crazy questions about social isolation. I, for one, feel a little less isolated talking to all of you, so thank you.
Exactly. And I think that, I don't know, I did try a game of Cards Against Humanities with my family on Zoom. It was so chaotic. This felt a lot more socially connected than my family trying to do Cards Against Humanity. So thank you. and I do think that, as Diana pointed out, the ways that we're interacting today are not exactly the same quality of what we're able to do when we're in real life. And unless she's going to take us up on that offer to pay her and let us meet with our friends in coffee shops and do things like that, we're going to have to continue to do as we're doing, keeping calm and carrying on. We are glad that you are here with us today. We thank you for that. We're going to tell you a little bit about next week. We've been doing, as you can tell, we've been doing weekly events. So next week, we are going to try to bring to you virtually an event that we do fairly successfully in real life. We'll see how well we can translate it into the Zoom world. It's science speed dating. As I think I said last week, no actual dating is occurring. That's not what the national, there's no swipe left, swipe right. But we are going to bring you 5 really wonderful science communicators who will each talk about their work. They have a short little 7-minute opportunity to present, so it goes quickly. And so it's kind of a smorgasbord of science. So we have a neuroscientist who will be talking about the acquisition of language from age 0, which is really fascinating. We have a cognitive scientist who talks to dolphins. So there's another kind of talking that goes back and forth. We have a biomedical engineer who is kind of making us all superhuman with the technology that he's creating. And we have a mathematician who's going to talk about voting and gerrymandering, and an astronomer who is it's on this theme of communication, who is looking to communicate with extraterrestrials. He works for SETI. So it's going to be a really good group. We hope that you will be part of our audience. And to take us out, we have a short video. We partnered with the Fathomers, a group called the Fathomers, to do our last in-person speed dating event. And so we're going to leave you with a little 1-minute reel to give you a sense of what that feels like in person. And then I guess you can tell us after next week how well we did at recreating speed dating in the virtual world. But again, thank you to all three of our speakers. This was an important conversation and one we were really glad to have. So thank you for being here. Thank our speakers. And I guess, bye, Rick.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the video.
Yep.
When we go out and prove what these asteroids are made of, maybe there will be asteroid mining.
What if we create alternative memories of the future that heal trauma?
These tiny microscopic organisms have these big global scale impacts.
And so if we intentionally rebias AI for what the world that we actually want, then maybe we'll get a different existence.
The real question we should be asking is, how do you build trust into AI systems?
You have two separate black holes merging to form one black hole. That's a profound moment.
Did anybody else get chills when he said when two black holes become one? This has been a dream come true for me. I never would imagine I'd be dating all of you. I can't thank you all enough for being here. Good night.